recently reported on some very interesting history about a tribal historian and interpreter named Louis Mann and how his descendants are now getting to hear his voice from over 100 years ago based on some archived recordings that have been uncovered and restored. Tell us more about the history there.
Yeah, so Louis Mann, he wasn't a tribal chief or wasn't a leader of the tribe. He was an interpreter back in the early 1900s. At this point in time, the Yakama Nation was very young. The treaty was signed in 1855, and this was a time when the United States, the tribe, and the new state of Washington were trying to figure out their relationship. And so Louis Mann was kind of like this link between tribal leadership at the Yakama Nation and elected government officials in Washington D.C. and Olympia. And that's really how he saw his role, according to his family, not as a leader, but as this link between two nations. But he really had his own strong voice, which can be seen in letters to the Bureau of Reclamation. He wrote to President Calvin Coolidge as well. And he's really seen as this strong person who fought for tribal rights for the Yakama Nation.
And we are hearing his voice again because of these archived recordings that have been restored, like I said, and also seeing him again because he had actually been photographed by photographers at the time who were kind of from outside the Yakama Nation and were kind of, documenting people of the West at the time. But in some of your reporting, you brought up the notion that there's some, I don't know what the right word might be, problematic. We hear that term a lot applied these days in terms of just maybe how the subjects of these recordings and the photographs were sort of treated by, kind of the white historians and documentors who were coming through at the time. Talk a little about what some of those concerns were at the time and still are now.
Right. So you're right. We're hearing about him because local historian Emily Washins, who's a Yakama Nation tribal member, found these recordings that were in wax cylinders, very delicate things that had actually survived 100+ years. But Louis Mann's family didn't know about these recordings. These were recordings that were taken by famed photographer Edward Curtis, who was traveling the country photographing Native Americans. And those recordings and the photographs he took were taken away from tribal members, and they're in museums, they're in archives. And so that brings up the question, what do those institutions do now with those materials? Because there are people like Alvin Schuster, who is a descendant of Louis Mann, who didn't know about the recordings. So it's a very kind of problematic because those materials are seen as property, those descendants. And actually Louis Mann's recordings, there are 6 that survived. 4 of them are ceremonial songs, and I haven't gotten to listen to them yet because they're meant to be sung in the context of funerals and private things like that. And so it's kind of giving people a chance to relearn these songs that have kind of been lost to time. There's also this question of, the Edward Curtis is a very controversial figure because when he photographed Native Americans, he kind of romanticized them and painted them as a dying people, which is not true. And it's actually, he didn't photograph Louis Mann because Louis Mann would dress in a suit and tie. As an interpreter, he wanted to portray a certain image when he went to Olympia in D.C. And so that takes into, there's this question of how do you reckon with these materials and the people who collected them, but still make that connection with your ancestors.
Well, it's interesting history, an interesting story, and we thank you for helping inform the broader Northwest about it. Enrique, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
See more of Enrique's reporting on these and other topics at nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.